Surrey, November 1814. The door to the morning room at Ashworth House was not fully closed, which was the kind of detail that changed the direction of a life. Sable Thurston had not intended to eavesdrop. She had been directed to the morning room by a footman who had confused her with the seamstress expected that afternoon, an error that said everything about how she had been received at Ashworth House and nothing about who she actually was. She had corrected the footman quietly, without embarrassment, and followed his redirected gesture toward the morning room, where she was to wait for the Dowager Duchess, and where the door had been left 6 inches ajar by someone who had not expected the conversation inside to carry. It carried. The voice was male, assured, and speaking with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never wondered whether he was being overheard. "She is plain and unremarkable," the voice said. "I have seen the woman twice at the Fenimore Ball, and once at Lady Dalrymple's card evening, and there is nothing in her appearance or her manner that would distinguish her from any of the 40 other women in the room. She is adequate. She is forgettable. And she is, I am told, the candidate my mother has selected for my consideration, which tells me a great deal about my mother's priorities and very little about the woman herself." Sable stood in the corridor, with her hand 3 inches from the door, and heard every word. She did not move. She did not gasp. She stood very still and listened to the rest. The second voice was female, older, and carried the authority of a woman who had raised the man speaking and was not impressed by him. "You saw her 3 times, the Dowager said, and concluded she was unremarkable. That is not an assessment, Tarquin. That is a confession of inattention." "I was attentive enough," the Duke said. "You were attentive to her face and her gown," the Dowager said. "You were not attentive to the fact that she reorganized Lady Dalrymple's entire card table seating in under 4 minutes, when the arrangement collapsed after the Pennington party arrived late, and did it so quietly that Lady Dalrymple believed she had done it herself. That is not an unremarkable woman. That is a woman who has learned to be invisible because visibility in her position invites the precise judgment you have just delivered." A pause. Sable noted the quality of it, the texture of a man who had been contradicted by his mother and was deciding whether to concede or fortify. He fortified. "Mother," he said, "I require a duchess who will represent this family in society. I require presence, a woman who enters a room and the room is aware of it. These are not excessive requirements. They are practical." The Dowager's voice dropped into the register Sable recognized from her own mother, the one that meant the conversation had moved past discussion and into verdict. "Your father," the Dowager said, "married a woman the room was aware of. He spent 30 years aware of her. It was not the kind of awareness you are imagining." The silence after this was absolute. Sable understood it completely. She understood that the Duke's requirements were not requirements at all. They were a scar dressed as a policy, inherited from watching his father's marriage, organized into a checklist so that it would not have to be examined as a feeling. She understood all of this in the 6 seconds of silence that followed, because Sable Thurston had spent her life understanding rooms that did not know she was understanding them. The footman reappeared. "Miss Thurston, the Dowager will receive you in the drawing room." Sable looked at the morning room door, still ajar, still containing a Duke who had called her forgettable, and a mother who had disagreed, and followed the footman without a sound. She sat in the drawing room and waited. The room was formal, overdressed in the way of houses decorated by the previous generation, and maintained by the current one out of obligation rather than taste. She noted the books on the side table, decorative, unread, chosen for the color of their spines rather than their contents. She thought about the word unremarkable. She thought about a man who had looked at her 3 times and seen nothing, and a mother who had looked at her once and seen everything. She was still thinking when the Dowager appeared. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth was 61 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never in her life leaned against anything. She entered the drawing room and looked at Sable with focused, unhurried attention. "Miss Thurston," she said. "Your Grace," Sable said, and stood and curtsied. The curtsy was perfect, precisely the depth and duration that the rank required, calibrated to the inch. It said nothing personal. It communicated nothing beyond competence. It was, in every respect, unremarkable. And that was the point. The Dowager watched the curtsy with the attention of a woman who understood what curtsies meant and what they concealed. "You have been told why you are here," the Dowager said. "I have been told that your Grace wished to discuss a matter of mutual interest," Sable said. "I have inferred the rest." The Dowager almost smiled. "What have you inferred?" "That your son requires a wife, that the family circumstances make the matter pressing, that my father's fortune makes me a practical candidate, and that your Grace has formed an opinion about my suitability that differs from your son's, which is why I am being received by you and not by him." "My son believes he knows what he needs," the Dowager said. "He has constructed a very specific portrait of the woman he intends to marry. She should be striking. She should command attention. She should fill a room simply by entering it. He does not understand that he has described his father's wife, not his own." Sable held her gaze. "I heard him," she said. The Dowager stilled. "The morning room," Sable said. The door was open. "I was in the corridor. I heard everything he said about me, including what your Grace said about the previous Duchess." Silence. The Dowager looked at the drawing room door, which was fully closed, and then back at Sable, and her expression underwent a revision. "And you are still here," the Dowager said. "I am still here," Sable said, "because a man who calls a woman unremarkable without knowing her has revealed more about himself than about her. And because your Grace defended me to your own son before you had met me, which tells me that this household contains at least one person whose judgment I am interested in." The Dowager sat. They sat across from each other in the overdressed drawing room. "My son will meet you formally at dinner on Friday," the Dowager said. "He will be polite because he was raised to be polite. He will assess you quickly and from the surface, because that is the habit he has developed. And he will conclude that his original assessment was correct." She leaned forward. "What he will not see is that you have just told me you overheard my son calling you plain to my face without flinching, and that you are sitting in this room having a conversation most women would have fled from 3 minutes ago." "What would you like me to do on Friday?" Sable said. "Nothing," the Dowager said. "Be exactly what you are. Let him see nothing. And when he has finished seeing nothing, we will find out whether he is the kind of man who looks again." Sable stood. She curtsied again, the same perfect, unremarkable curtsy, the one that said nothing and concealed everything. The Dowager watched her perform it with the expression of a woman who had found exactly what she had been looking for. "Friday," the Dowager said. "Friday," Sable agreed. She left Ashworth House in her father's carriage. Her father looked at her face and said, "Well?" She looked out the window at the Surrey countryside, brown and bare in November. "He does not know what he is looking for," she said. "His mother does." "And what are you?" She looked at the road ahead. "I am what I have always been," she said. "The woman no one sees coming." The dinner at Ashworth House on Friday was an occasion for 12. Sable arrived with her father, and the dark blue dress she had chosen because it was well made and unobtrusive, and precisely the kind of thing a plain woman would wear to a dinner where she expected to be overlooked. She expected to be overlooked because she had been instructed to be overlooked. The Dowager had said, "Be exactly what you are." And what Sable was, what she had always been, was the woman who entered a room and was absorbed by it, who sat at tables and listened while others performed, who noticed everything and displayed nothing, and who had turned this quality from a limitation into an instrument. She had not always understood it as an instrument. There had been years when being unseen had simply been painful, when she had stood at the edges of ballrooms and wondered what it was about her that made people's eyes move past her as though she were furniture. She had asked her mother once, at 14, why people did not look at her. Her mother, who had been beautiful and was now dead, had said, "They do not look at you because you do not ask them to. That is not a flaw. That is a choice you have not yet learned to make." She had learned. She had learned that the space between being overlooked and being invisible was the space in which the most useful information lived. She had learned that unremarkable was not the same as unobservant. The Duke of Ashworth, Tarquin Markable, was seated at the head of the table, and Sable was seated 5 places from him. She observed him. He was tall, dark-haired, 32, and possessed of the kind of face that had been handsome at 20 and had since acquired the particular set that came from managing a title and a family history that weighed more than he had expected when he inherited at 24. He managed the table with precision. He laughed twice during the first course, and both times the laugh was social rather than genuine, and Sable noted this because the difference between a genuine laugh and a performed one told her whether a person was present in a room or merely presiding over it. He was presiding. He was not present. He did not look at her once during the first course. He did not look at her during the second course either, though his mother, seated at the opposite end, glanced at her 3 times with the expression of a woman monitoring an experiment. The third course brought a conversation about the new lending library proposed by the Fenimores and opposed by Sir Alistair Caldwell, on grounds that Sable recognized immediately as financial rather than principled. The table discussed it. The Duke contributed a remark about the cost that was measured and non-committal. Sable said nothing. Then Lady Fenimore, who was generous and inclusive, turned to her and said, "Miss Thurston, you have been very quiet. Do you have an opinion on the lending library?" The table looked at her. 12 people, including the Duke, looked at the woman 5 places down who had been so quiet they had nearly forgotten she was present. Sable set down her fork. "The proposal allocates £60 for the initial collection and £12 annually for maintenance," she said. "The building requires a new roof at £14, bringing the first-year cost to £86. Sir Alistair's objection is that the parish cannot sustain this when the bridge at Crofton requires repair at £42. But the parish fund currently holds £163, which is sufficient for both projects, with £35 remaining. The question is not whether the parish can afford the library. The question is whether Sir Alistair would prefer the parish to accumulate a surplus rather than serve its residents, which is a different argument, and should be made honestly if it is going to be made at all. The silence that followed was the particular silence that occurred when a room recalibrated the person who had produced it. Sir Alistair looked at her with the expression of a man who had been publicly undressed by someone he had not considered worth monitoring. Lady Fenimore looked at her with delight. The Dowager looked at her with controlled satisfaction, and the Duke of Ashworth looked at her for the first time. Not the glancing surface assessment he had given her at the Fenimore ball. He looked at her with the sudden, focused attention of a person encountering information that did not match the file, and Sable met his gaze and held it for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be seen and short enough to be deniable, and then returned to her plate. She did not smile. she did not perform. She picked up her fork and resumed eating as though she had not just dismantled a baronet's position with parish arithmetic delivered from memory. The evening ended. The carriages were called. The Duke appeared near enough for acknowledgement. "Miss Thurston," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly. "Your Grace," she said. "The parish figures," he said. "You had those from memory." "I pay attention to things," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the entrance hall was full of people not noticing that the Duke was standing in front of the plain woman who had heard herself called forgettable and had decided to make that judgment cost him something. "Evidently," he said. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, the same perfect, unremarkable curtsy, and left. In the carriage, her father said, "You prepared." She looked at her hands. "I always prepare," she said. "It is what unremarkable women do." She thought about a duke who had looked at her for the first time and had not yet understood what he had seen. She thought, "He will look again." She thought, "I will be ready." The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was in the Duke's own hand. "Miss Thurston," it read, "the parish fund figures you cited at dinner have been the subject of discussion. Sir Alistair has disputed your bridge estimate, claiming £47 rather than 42. I have consulted the parish records and find your figure correct. I mention this not because the £5 difference is material, but because accuracy, when publicly offered, should be publicly confirmed. Ashworth." Sable read this 3 times. He had verified her figures himself rather than sending his steward, because the letter was in his own hand and referenced the records directly. He had written to tell her she was right, which served no practical purpose except to establish that he had been paying attention to what she said after the evening should have been concluded. He had not concluded it. He had gone to the parish clerk and checked her arithmetic and written a letter about it. And the letter said, "Accuracy should be publicly confirmed," which was the kind of sentence a man wrote when he was describing a principle and did not yet realize he was describing an interest. She wrote back, "Your Grace, I appreciate the confirmation, though I would not have cited figures I had not already verified. The £5 discrepancy likely reflects the original estimate from March, before Mr. Carver revised his price in September. Sir Alistair's information is not wrong. It is merely outdated, which is a different category of error, and one frequently confused with dishonesty, when it is more accurately described as inattention. S. Thurston." The word inattention was aimed not only at Sir Alistair, but at himself, at the man who had looked at her 3 times and seen nothing. His reply came the following morning. "Miss Thurston, I accept the distinction between inattention and dishonesty. I accept further that the former, in certain circumstances, may be the more consequential failing." Ashworth. 2 letters in 2 days, both in his own hand, both about figures neither of them actually cared about in the amount they were discussing them. She thought, "This is what it looks like when someone begins to pay attention and does not yet know that paying attention is the first thing that changes." On Saturday, a note from the Dowager. "Miss Thurston, my son has visited the parish clerk. He has not visited the parish clerk in 4 years. I draw no conclusions. I merely observe." Sable read this and almost smiled. She thought, "He has checked my arithmetic. That is more interesting than flowers." The lending library opened in the first week of December, faster than anyone had expected, because Sable had written to Lady Fenimore and offered to manage the acquisition. She had the collection sourced, catalogued, and delivered in 3 weeks. 214 volumes organized by subject, with a handwritten catalogue she had produced in 3 evenings at her desk. The Duke arrived at 2:30. She had not expected him. Dukes did not attend parish library openings unless they had a reason the occasion itself did not provide. He came with his steward, and the composed manner of a man presenting his attendance as routine, which it was not, and which everyone in the room understood was not. He walked the room. He examined the shelves. He stopped at the catalog and read it with focused attention, the kind that meant he was actually processing information rather than performing interest. He read every page. He paused twice, once at the natural history section and once at the agricultural collection. He found her eventually. The room was small enough that finding her required no effort, and the effort he made to make it appear incidental was, she observed, considerable. "Miss Thurston," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "The catalog," he said. "You compiled it." It was not a question. He had read it and recognized the handwriting or the organizational logic, or both, and he was confirming rather than asking, which told her something about how carefully he had been reading. "I did," she said. He looked at her. The December light through the grain store windows was gray and flat, and it made the room plain, and it made her plain, and he looked at her in that plain light with an expression that was no longer the dismissive surface scan she had received at the Fenimore Ball. "The agricultural section," he said. "You have included Tull and Young, but also Bakewell's breeding papers, which are not commonly available outside of institutional collections. My father's bookseller has connections with the Royal Society Library," she said. "I thought they would be useful to the tenant farmers, several of whom are already implementing selective breeding practices without the theoretical framework." "You know the tenant farmers' practices," he said. "I have spoken with 3 of them since we arrived in Surrey," she said. "Mr. Holt at Crofton is particularly advanced. He has been selecting for wool density for 6 years, with results that would interest anyone familiar with Bakewell's methodology." The quiet that followed was the silence of a man adding information to a ledger that had started nearly empty and was filling faster than he had anticipated. "You are very thorough," he said. She met his gaze. "I am very unremarkable," she said. "It leaves a great deal of time for thoroughness." The word landed exactly where she had placed it. She watched him receive it, the slight shift in his expression, the recalibration of a man who has been handed something he recognizes, and she held his gaze for 1 beat, then turned back to Mrs. Caldwell and left him standing beside the catalog with the knowledge that she had heard him, that she had not forgotten, and that the word unremarkable was going to follow him for some time. He stayed for another 40 minutes. He did not talk to her again, but his attention returned to her location in the room with a frequency that was no longer incidental. And when he left, he paused at the door and looked back once, and it was the first time it had cost him something to leave a room she was in. In the carriage afterward, her father said, "The Duke attended the library opening." "He did," Sable said. "He read your catalog," her father said. "He read the entire catalog." "He is a thorough man," she said. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who recognized the particular quality of stillness she adopted when she was managing something that was not a room. "Sable," he said. "It is a lending library," she said. "It serves the parish. The Duke's attendance is appropriate and unremarkable." Her father said nothing further, with the eloquence of a man who recognized the word unremarkable as a deflection and was choosing to let it stand. January brought the rain, and the drainage at the eastern edge of the Thurston property failed on a Wednesday morning. Sable was in the flooded field by 9, in ruined boots and a practical coat, with her father's estate manager and a surveyor she had engaged 3 days earlier, when the first signs of failure appeared. She had seen it coming. She had walked the drainage channels in December and noted the silting in the eastern culvert. The repair required access to the drainage channel on Ashworth land because it fed into a larger system that crossed both properties. She did not write. She did not send a message through intermediaries. She walked to the boundary wall in her ruined boots, crossed it at the stile, and walked to the Ashworth estate office, where the Duke's steward kept his operations. The steward, a careful man named Greaves, listened to her explanation with the attention of a man who recognized competence when it appeared at his door at 10 in the morning in the rain. "The junction is the issue," she said, pointing to the map. "The work requires 2 days and access to 80 yards of the Ashworth drainage channel. The Holts have lambing in 2 weeks. I would prefer not to explain to Mr. Holt that his lambing shed flooded because a boundary line was more important than a drainage junction." The Duke arrived 20 minutes later in a riding coat and muddy boots. He came through the door and saw her and stopped for 1 second, recalibrating. "Miss Thurston," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Your drainage junction is flooding my meadow." He looked at the survey map she had spread on Greaves's desk. He looked at the flow calculations she had marked in her own hand. "Show me," he said. They walked to the junction together in the rain, and he asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the problem, and one that surprised her. "You predicted this," he said. "I walked the channels in December," she said. "The collapse was inevitable with sustained rain." He looked at the flooded meadow. He looked at her. "You walked the drainage channels in December." She met his gaze. "I walk everything," she said. "It is how I understand what I am responsible for." He was quiet. The rain fell on both of them without discrimination, and he looked at this woman in her ruined boots, who had walked to his estate office uninvited and spread a survey map on his steward's desk, and used the phrase, "what I am responsible for," as though it included things that were not technically hers. "The access is yours," he said. "Greaves will coordinate. I want the junction repaired properly, not patched. If the channel needs clearing for its full length, clear it." "That is more than I asked for," she said. "The channel has been neglected," he said. "I should have addressed it before it became your problem." She watched the specific quality of the admission, the way he said, "I should have," without deflection. She thought, this is what revision looks like when a man does it honestly. "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical matter," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is entirely practical." He paused. "You might call me by my name," he said. "Given that you are standing on my land in the rain, arguing about my drainage, the formality seems somewhat excessive." "Tarquin," she said. Something moved in his expression, something that had been held in place by formality and habit, and that the sound of his name in her voice had displaced by exactly the amount required to be visible. "Sable," he said back, her name, in his voice, in the rain. She had not expected it to matter. It rearranged something. "The drainage work," she said, because she needed a sentence that was not about the rearrangement, "will take 2 days." "Good," he said. "Keep me informed." He paused. "Directly?" "Directly," she agreed. He walked back toward the estate office, and she stood at the junction in the January rain and thought about the word directly and the way he had said her name. She thought, this was supposed to be a drainage problem. She thought, it has become something else. February brought the winter assembly at the Fenimore House, 40 people, the full county, the social machinery running at the capacity that Surrey demanded of its winter occasions. In the week since the drainage work, Sable had received 4 letters from the Duke. The first concerned the drainage results, which was reasonable. The second concerned the lending library's circulation figures, which was less reasonable. The third enclosed a paper on soil composition annotated in his hand, which was not reasonable at all. The fourth concerned nothing identifiable as a subject, and was, she understood, a letter written by a man who wanted to write, and had not yet admitted to himself why. She had replied to each one. Her replies were precise and factual, and contained within them, buried so far beneath the surface that only a very attentive reader would detect them, the quality of a woman who was enjoying being written to, and was not going to say so. She had also come to know Mrs. Edith Langley, a widow of 48, who had appointed herself keeper of the county's standards. Mrs. Langley had been pleasant in November, less pleasant in December, after the lending library she had not been consulted about, and silent in January, which was worse, because silence from Mrs. Langley meant she was preparing something. The Duke was across the room when Sable entered. He looked up, and the look was no longer the assessing one. It was the one that had been building since the dinner, the one that lived in the space between formal attention and something he had not yet named. She received it and set it aside because the room required her attention before he did. The evening moved as these evenings moved, the circulations, the conversations that formed and dissolved, the careful social choreography of 40 people managing their positions in a public space. Sable talked with Lady Fenimore about the library's second month. She talked with Mrs. Caldwell about the spring planting. She was aware, during all of this, that the Duke's attention was tracking her through the room, not visibly. He was managing his social obligations with the precision of a man who had been doing it for 12 years and could do it without surrendering the part of his attention that was, she had come to understand, permanently allocated to her location. She had developed a corresponding allocation. This was inconvenient. He found her during the second hour, appearing at her left at the moment she had concluded a conversation with old Mr. Ashford about his greenhouse. His arrival was smooth enough to appear coincidental and deliberate enough that she knew it was not. "The lending library is circulating at twice the rate Lady Fenimore projected," he said. "You have been reviewing the circulation figures," she said. "Greaves mentioned them." He paused. "I may have asked Greaves to mention them." She almost smiled. The almost was the point. She let him see the outline of it without giving him the thing itself. "I track everything," she said. "It is what unremarkable women do with their considerable free time." Before he could respond, Mrs. Langley arrived at her right shoulder with the precision of a woman who had been circling for 20 minutes. There were 6 people within hearing. "Miss Thurston," Mrs. Langley said, "what a pleasure. I was saying just last week how admirable it is that you have made yourself so useful. The lending library, the drainage, the parish figures. Such industry." She paused. One does wonder whether the industry is directed at the parish or at something rather closer to hand. She let her gaze move from Sable to the Duke and back. The implication landed with the precision she had designed it to. It said, "You are a merchant's daughter pursuing a duke, and everyone can see it." Sable felt the heat of it, the surgical accuracy, because it was not entirely wrong. And the things that were not entirely wrong cut deepest. She was preparing her response when the Duke's voice came from her left. Not the dinner table voice, or the letter voice, or the drainage junction voice. The one underneath all of them. The one that carried the Ashworth name and 300 years of Surrey in it. "Miss Thurston's contributions to the parish," he said, "include a lending library that has served 47 borrowers in 2 months, a drainage intervention that protected 3 tenant families from flooding, and parish budget analysis that corrected a £5 error in the public accounts." He looked at Mrs. Langley with complete level attention. "The industry is directed at this community. I would hope everyone in this county recognizes the value of a neighbor who contributes rather than merely commenting." "Of course," she said. I understood what you meant," the Duke said, and his voice had not risen, and his expression had not changed, and the absence of both was more decisive than either would have been. He held her gaze one moment longer than convention required, then returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred. Mrs. Langley found someone else to talk to within 30 seconds. Sable stood beside the Duke in the aftermath and felt the weight of what had happened. He had defended her without rescuing her. He had stated facts. He had made it about the parish, which meant Mrs. Langley had no graceful way to continue, and Sable had been defended without being diminished. She crossed the room to Lady Fenimore, who looked at her face, and then at the Duke and back. "Well," Lady Fenimore said. "He intervened," Sable said. "He made it about the facts," Lady Fenimore said, "because the facts supported you completely, and it allowed you to be defended without being claimed." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a man who considers his neighbor unremarkable." Sable held her glass and thought about 3 months of letters and drainage ditches and parish accounts, and a man who had called her plain in November and had just spent his authority defending her in February without raising his voice. Sable looked across the room at the Duke. He looked back. Not the assessing attention. The other one. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. 1 beat longer than the social register required. Then she turned back to Lady Fenimore, and the assembly continued, and neither of them said anything further about what had happened, and it cost them both considerably. He came to the Thurston house on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the assembly, on foot, which told her the visit had not been delegated or filtered through social machinery. She was in the study. The housekeeper showed him there because Sable received visitors in the study, not the drawing room, because the study was where she worked. He came in and looked at the desk covered in planting schedules and drainage maps. "You work here," he said. "Every morning," she said. She poured tea and offered him a cup without asking whether he wanted one. He took it. He sat across from her desk. He did not drink it. "I owe you something," he said. She waited. "In November," he said. "In the morning room." He set down the cup and looked at her with an expression that was not managed at all. "You heard me," he said. "Everything," she said. "Plain and unremarkable. Nothing to distinguish her from any of the 40 other women in the room." "I remember the count." "I was wrong," he said. "Not in the way a man is wrong when he misjudges a painting or a horse. I was wrong in the way a man is wrong when he walks into a room and sees nothing because he has decided in advance what everything looks like. I saw my own categories. I did not see you." He paused. "My father married a woman who filled rooms. She filled them with noise and spectacle and the kind of presence everyone noticed and no one could manage. I grew up watching that marriage. I grew up watching a man who had chosen a woman for her visibility spend 30 years being destroyed by it. When I inherited," he said, "I decided I would look for the opposite. Someone quiet and manageable. And I would call those things practical and organize the requirements into a list. And the list would protect me from my father's mistake. The list was not about finding the right person," he said. "It was about avoiding a feeling. And when my mother put your name forward, I called you unremarkable because unremarkable was what I thought I wanted, and I did not understand that I had built the entire framework on the wrong question." "What was the wrong question?" she said. "The wrong question was, what do I need to avoid? The right question, which I have been learning since November, is what have I been failing to see?" She was quiet. She thought about this man who had walked to her house and named the wound without deflection and traced it to its source. "You did not see me," she said. "No, I did not stay to argue with you in November," she said. "Not because I was hurt, though I was. I stayed quiet because I understood that you were not describing me. You were describing what you were afraid of. And arguing with a man's fear does not change the fear. It only forces him to defend it. So I left," she said, "and I came back. And I built a lending library and fixed a drainage ditch and corrected the parish accounts. And I let you see me in increments, because the kind of seeing you needed to do was not the kind that could be demanded. You had to earn your own attention." He was quiet for a long time. The study was warm, and the February morning was gray outside the window, and the tea was cold in both their cups. "You knew," he said. From the beginning. You knew what I was doing and why, and you stayed anyway. I stayed because your mother defended me before she had met me, and a household that produces that kind of loyalty is worth understanding. And because you checked my parish figures yourself rather than sending your steward. And a man who checks arithmetic is a man who is paying attention even when he does not know it. She paused. And because you said unremarkable, she said, and then spent 3 months proving you did not believe it. He stood. He came around the desk. She stood because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were very close in the study with the February light and the planting schedules between them. I was wrong about you, he said, before I met you. In the morning room, at the dinner, and the library and the drainage junction, and at every point where I should have been paying attention, and was not. And I am asking, he said, and his voice had dropped below every register into the one that was just him, just the man who had walked here in February and named his wound. Whether I have earned it. Whether I have earned the right to see you. She looked at him. She thought about the morning room and the word unremarkable and the months of increments. She thought about a man who had checked her arithmetic and read her catalog and stood in the rain and used her name and defended her without raising his voice. She thought about the curtsy, the perfect, unremarkable curtsy she had performed in his presence, the one that said nothing and concealed everything. She did not curtsy. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate. You have earned it, she said. He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he was not going to qualify. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to parish accounts and drainage maps and every true thing she had ever decided, and the study was warm, and neither of them required any further management. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. The drainage junction, she said, is functioning, he said. The lending library is circulating. The parish accounts are balanced. Are we conducting an audit? He said. I am establishing that the practical matters are in order before addressing the impractical ones, she said. And are the impractical matters in order? They are entirely in order, she said. March in Surrey was the county remembering itself. Sable and the Duke were engaged by the second week. He had asked formally in the study on a Wednesday morning, because Tarquin had learned that the study was where Sable was herself. I have been revising my assessment for 4 months, he said. The revision is complete. The conclusion is that I would like to spend the remainder of my life being revised by you. That is not a conventional proposal, she said. I have been told you find conventional assessments insufficient. Yes, she said. They had shaken hands. The absurdity registered approximately 4 seconds later, and she had said, We have sealed a marriage the way I seal a drainage contract. And he had said, I find the precedent appropriate. And she had laughed. The small, real laugh she produced so rarely that he received it with the expression she now knew was his version of complete happiness. Her father received the news that evening. He set down the Manchester accounts he had been reviewing and looked at his daughter with the attention of a man who had understood exactly what was happening since approximately December. The Duke of Ashworth, he said. The man who called you unremarkable. He has revised that assessment considerably, she said. Her father looked at her. Has he? He walked to this house in February and told me he was wrong without qualification, she said. He traced the error to its source. He named what he was afraid of, and he did not ask me to forgive it. He asked whether he had earned the right to see me clearly. She paused. I find I cannot hold a man's November against him when his February is everything it should be. Her father was quiet. He looked at the desk, at the planting schedules and the drainage maps, the accumulated evidence of a daughter who had arrived in Surrey and made herself indispensable to a county that had not known it needed her. "Is he good enough for you?" her father said. She thought about this with the honesty it deserved, the precision that did not permit flattering approximations. "He is learning to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." Her father nodded. "It is," he agreed. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon. The letter was brief and direct and contained the precise dimensions of the Thurston fortune, stated without apology, the way her father stated everything important. The Duke's reply to her father's letter arrived the following morning, addressed to Sable. It said, "Your father's letter was thorough and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you, not a balance sheet. I have learned recently that the things I fail to see are more important than the things I count. T." She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9. The Dowager called on Thursday with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 4 days and had reached its absolute limit. "He proposed in your study," the Dowager said. "At my desk," Sable said, "between the planting schedule and the lending library accounts. He was happy when he called on me yesterday," the Dowager said. "I have not seen him happy in years." "You are good for him." "He is good for me," Sable said, "which is the thing I did not expect. I expected to prove a point. I expected to be right. I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." What was he right about? That a woman who goes unseen is not the same as a woman who is unremarkable. He had entirely the wrong framework. But the instinct was not wrong. The Dowager smiled. Not the social smile. The real one. The one that belonged to a woman who had survived 40 years of society and a difficult marriage and a son who had inherited his father's wound and who had finally begun to set it down. "He is going to discover," the Dowager said, "that he has acquired a duchess who will run his estate better than he does." "He has already discovered it," Sable said. "He mentioned it during the proposal. He described it as a preliminary finding." The Dowager set down her teacup. "He proposed to you with a finding." "He proposed with a revised assessment followed by a conclusion," Sable said. "The conclusion was excellent. The assessment was also excellent in its way. It was honest. I find I prefer honest assessments to elaborate ones." "Yes," the Dowager said. "I imagine you do." She stood with the efficiency of a woman who had received everything she came for. "The engagement dinner," she said. "I will host it at Ashworth, first week of April. Mrs. Langley will be invited." Sable looked at her. "Because," the Dowager said, "the sight of Mrs. Langley congratulating you on your engagement to my son will be among the more satisfying things I have witnessed in some years, and I am not above enjoying it." "I find I am not above it either," Sable said. The engagement dinner was on the 4th of April, a Friday, which the Dowager had chosen because Friday dinners in Surrey set the tone for the season, and she wanted this tone set correctly. 44 people, the full county. The table arranged in the long dining room at Ashworth House with the precision of a woman who understood seating as a form of argument. Sable was seated at Tarquin's right, which was where a future duchess belonged, and also where the Dowager had placed her because it was the most visible seat in the room, and visibility, which had once been the thing Sable lacked, was now the thing the Dowager intended to give her in the most comprehensive way available. She wore dark blue, not the same dress from November, a better one, cut in London by someone who understood that dark blue on a woman with her coloring was not a disappearance, but a choice. She wore her mother's pearl brooch, which was simple and correct. "The blue again," he said. "It works," she said. "It does," he said. He looked at the room, the 44 people settling into their positions, and he looked at her over his wineglass with the full undefended attention that she had earned, and he had learned, and neither of them were going to pretend, was anything other than what it was. "Are you prepared for 44 people's opinions about our engagement?" he said. "I have been managing rooms since I was 16, she said. "I am entirely prepared." "I know," he said. "I am asking for my benefit, not yours." "The correct standard," she said quietly, "is considerably above fine, and you have been meeting it for some time." Mrs. Langley congratulated them after the meal in the drawing room, with the composed grace of a woman who had no remaining options and was executing them flawlessly. She said the correct things. She said them to Tarquin first, and then to Sable. And when she said them to Sable, she met her eyes, and Sable met hers with the composed directness that was her permanent condition, and nothing further was required. Tarquin beside her said nothing. His presence was the statement. The dowager across the room watched this exchange with controlled satisfaction. Sable thought about the assembly, the moment before his intervention, and her brief annoyance that he had spoken before she could. She had then thought about the specific quality of what he said, the way he had made it about the community, so that she had been defended without being diminished. She was not a woman who needed protection. She had never needed it. She was also, she had concluded, a woman who could receive someone standing beside her without it meaning she could not stand alone. Those were not the same thing, and she had been treating them as the same thing for so long that the distinction had nearly escaped her. They were married in June at the village church, between the Ashworth estate and the Thurston property. She wore dark blue. Nobody was surprised. The county turned out, because the marriage of this duke to this woman was a story they had been following since November, with the invested attention of people who had known something was going to happen and had not been entirely certain what. Sable walked in on her father's arm and looked at Tarquin at the front of the church and thought about the morning room and the word unremarkable and the door that had been left 6 inches ajar. She thought about the curtsy, the first in the drawing room, perfect and unremarkable, saying nothing and concealing everything. The second, at the Friday dinner, meaning I have shown you something and you do not yet know what it is. The third, at the assembly, the deliberate absence of it. She had thought about the fourth version since March and had decided it would not be a curtsy at all. She reached the front of the church. Tarquin looked at her with the full unmanaged attention, the expression that had nothing of November in it, nothing of the categories and the checklist and the policy built from a wound. Just this. Just him. She did not curtsy. She extended her hand, the hand of a woman who balanced parish accounts and built lending libraries, and had walked into his life through a 6-inch gap in a door. He took it with the firm grip of a man who meant what he agreed to and did not let go. And the church was full, and the June morning was warm, and the county was watching. And Sable thought, this is what it looks like when an unremarkable woman is finally, completely seen. The wedding breakfast was at Ashworth House because it was the larger house, and because the county expected it, and because Sable had already identified 4 things she intended to change about the dining room arrangement, which she had told Tarquin about on a walk through the East Wing in March, and he had looked at her and said, before or after the ceremony, and she had said, the order is negotiable, and he had said, nothing about you is negotiable, except possibly the library catalog. She moved through the breakfast with the ease of a woman on her own ground, which it was not yet technically, but was in every way that mattered. She talked with the Fenimores and the Caldwells and Sir Alistair, who had recently discovered that he agreed with Sable about the parish fund and had revised his memory accordingly. She talked with the dowager, who had the expression of a woman who had set something in motion and watched it exceed her expectations. Her father found her at the edge of the room in the late afternoon. He's happy, she said. Are you? "I am," she said. "I am also still annotating 3 things he said in January that were technically accurate and entirely unnecessary, and I intend to revisit them when the appropriate moment arrives." "You are going to be a magnificent duchess," her father said. "I know," she said. "I intend to be." He laughed, the full, genuine laugh of a man who had spent 26 years being proud of this particular person, and had decided today was the correct occasion to let it show entirely. Tarquin found her in the garden as the June light moved across the Surrey countryside in the long, golden way of evenings that did not want to end. She was looking at the rose beds with the focused attention of a woman already redesigning something. "The roses," he said. "They are in the wrong beds," she said. "The climbers should be on the south wall." "Sable," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that was entirely his own, the one that had nothing of November in it, and everything of the month since. The June evening was warm, and the Surrey countryside was doing what it did in June, which was to be so comprehensively itself that there was no room for anything that was not true. "The roses are yours," he said. "All of it. The garden and the library and the drainage and the parish and the county. All of it is yours in every sense that matters, and I want you to know that I know that." She looked at the roses and thought about the word unremarkable, and what it had meant in November, and what it meant in June, and how completely a word could turn itself inside out over 7 months. "Tarquin," she said. "Yes, I heard you through a door. 7 months ago. You said I was plain and unremarkable. You said there was nothing to distinguish me from 40 other women." He waited. He had learned to wait. "You were right," she said. "If you are looking at the surface, I am not the woman who stands out. I am not beautiful. I do not fill rooms by entering them." She looked at him. "But I balance them," she said. "I read them and organize them and understand them. And the reason no one notices is because the work is done before anyone thinks to look. You called me unremarkable, and I spent 7 months showing you what unremarkable means when it is paying attention." She curtsied. It was not the unremarkable curtsy. It was a full, deliberate, unhurried curtsy, the deepest she had ever performed, the kind that required complete control to execute and complete intention to offer. And when she rose, she looked at him directly. "I see you. You see me. I am not concealing anything anymore." He understood it completely. She saw him understand it. She saw the word unremarkable turn itself inside out in his expression, from a judgment he had delivered to a quality he had discovered, from something he had dismissed to something he would spend the rest of his life learning to deserve. "Sable," he said, and her name in his voice had all of November and December and January and every month since in it, and none of it was a wound anymore. "Tarquin," she said. He took her hand. She let him take it. The June evening went on around them, warm and unhurried, entirely indifferent to whether any of this had been practical, and the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in November. The most important things, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after they had happened than before. She understood this one completely.